absolutely shocked that they would do a presidential address to the nation, a joint session of Congress, and have 200 people in the House chamber that would normally have over 1,700. It just, to me, it communicated weakness because they're afraid of a virus. And as pointed out from Congressman Burgess, every member of Congress, they were the first in line to get vaccinated. And I was talking to another member yesterday. We're in, and I'm the same thing. We're on a plane flying to DC back and forth each week, and you're in there elbow to elbow. And you can do that for 3 hours across the country, but you can't sit next to another member of Congress who has been vaccinated. I think this is more about the Democrats, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, controlling Congress and the American people. It's the same thing with the mask. It's all about control. And I'm telling you, I think it's about time to say enough is enough. In fact, I haven't done this yet, but I'm thinking about it. If they're still pushing these masks come July 4th, when we're supposed to be free to do backyard barbecues, I think we all ought to barbecue and burn our mask. Enough of this foolishness. All right. But here's something. There were some very alarming moments in his speech last night. I mean, alarming, very alarming. As he was talking about pulling out of Afghanistan and not being involved in these forever wars, he made this comment. Clip 9, please.
And we won't ignore what our intelligence agencies have determined to be the most lethal terrorist threat to the homeland today. White supremacy is terrorism.
Okay, did you get that? We're over there fighting the Taliban, and we were just talking about this with Senator Johnson, or actually with, I think it was Roy Blunt was talking about this, that these folks, they want to kill us, okay? They've got all the time in the world. We have terrorism is spreading around the globe, and the greatest threat to the homeland, white supremacy. Joining me now to talk about this is FRC's Executive Vice President, who spent 36 and a half years in the United States Army, serving his last 4 years as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. He was also one of the founding members of the Delta Force in the Army. General, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Tony. I'm so glad to be back with you.
America's greatest threat is from white supremacy, really?
Yeah, Tony, first of all, I don't believe that the intelligence community has told the president that. That's the first thing. Secondly, if they have, then they're just flat wrong, or they've redefined terrorism. What I would say is what you and I talked about earlier today is that we're living through a big con. You know, when you come into Washington now, and most of your listeners and viewers are probably not in Washington on a routine basis, but it's a different Washington now. And you go to the Capitol and you got all this wire around the Capitol and around the White House. And you have National Guard still out on the streets out here. What's that all about? Does the threat warrant that? And the answer is no. And you heard it from the president last night. They're trying to convince Americans that we, people like you and me, white people in general, but also primarily white conservatives, white Christians, white activists are the real threat, and that we're the ones that breached the Capitol there because we were Donald Trump supporters. This is a big con that we're living through. And that statement, I heard nobody say anything on any of the commentary last night about that statement, but that should have been one of the first things that they talked about on the news media after that speech last night. Was the president has just identified white supremacy, and they can't define supremacy
right
as being the leading terrorist entity.
And the media, the leftist media, has conflated Christian nationalism with white supremacy. And now, according to the president, the intelligence community says they're the greatest threat to the nation.
That's right. And it's time for us to push back. It's time for us to start pushing back on this. And God bless Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who stood up and said there is no place in this state, in our public schools, for this critical race theory, because by definition, it is racist. It is dividing our nation, and it is racism.
Yeah, and as I was just talking about that with Roy Blunt, talking about the president saying we've got to address this systemic racism in our country, and behind him is a black vice president.
That's right.
And he served under a black president. I don't see how you can have systemic racism when those opportunities are presented to people of every background in our country. And of course, we talked about Tim Scott and the great job he did last night responding. I want to play another clip here because this is how the president opened his address. And he rolled some things in here. And this is what he did throughout the speech. He rolled some things in here that I think went undetected, but are quite significant because they're not true. Play clip number 10 again, please.
100 days since I took the oath of office and lifted my hand off our family Bible and inherited a nation, we all did, that was in crisis. The worst pandemic in a century, the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, the worst attack on our democracy since the Civil War. Now, after just 100 days, I can report to the nation, America is on the move again.
Well, America is certainly on the move, but it's moving in the wrong direction. But that's not what I wanted to focus on from that statement. What I wanted to focus on, what I am going to focus on, General, is this. He said this was the worst attack on our democracy since the Civil War, referring to January the 6th.
Yeah, listen, I don't know who writes his speeches for him, but they don't know a thing about history.
Well, and they're counting on the fact that most Americans don't know their history.
And they're right. Most Americans don't know history. But the reality is that he has forgotten 9/11. He has forgotten Pearl Harbor, both of which killed lots of Americans. And furthermore, he has obviously is not aware that in 1956, there was actually 4 Puerto Ricans that came in. They were Puerto Rican nationalists. They came in the chamber and got up and shot 4 members of Congress inside, right inside there. And then in 1983, they had a bombing at the offices there of one of the senators. And it was designed, according to what they found out later, to kill Republican senators. So what about those? Do they count? I mean, there really was no violence perpetrated that comes anywhere close to that. There were some people killed, and I acknowledge that, and it's a terrible tragedy. And you know how I feel about the breach of the Capitol.
Right.
It is.
We agree.
It is no excuse.
Right.
Inexcusable. I don't care if there were rabble rousers there and people followed them in. There's no excuse for breaching our Capitol and doing what they did.
But there's no legitimate reason that the left should use January 6th the way they're using it and portraying it, because it is not true.
It is absolutely not true. And again, history would bear out that we have had much greater attacks on this country and on that Capitol than what happened there on the 6th of January, in my view.
But in the president's address, nothing about the year-long crusade to burn cities across America by the left. And, he mentioned law enforcement, but only in passing, as he talked about passing laws that would essentially handcuff law enforcement in this country. And he said, well, we love our law enforcement too.
Yeah. I just want to remind people of one thing. Before all of this COVID stuff started and everything, it was Black Lives Matters that had a chant. What do we want? Dead cops. When do we want them now? Pigs in a blanket, fry them like bacon. Are they domestic terrorists? Have you ever heard them declared domestic terrorists? And how about Antifa? How about Antifa that goes out there armed with baseball bats and clubs and that kind of thing? Are they domestic terrorists? No.
General,
this is about white supremacy. It goes back to what we talked about earlier.
But we know that this is not just rhetoric, because the president, while it's certainly baseless, they are using it to launch these initiatives in our nation's military
That's right.
to identify what they call extremists.
Mhm.
What is this going to do to our nation's military? I mean, first off, let me start before we go to our nation's military. Let's take his statement last night about the greatest threat to the homeland are white supremacists. What are our real enemies? How did they respond to that?
Oh, yeah. Do you think that the Chinese don't just love to hear that? You think the Russians don't love to hear that? You think that Kim Jong-un doesn't love to hear that kind of thing? That we have taken our eye off the ball, as a nation because of this president. He is not serious about the defense of this nation. Either that or he is totally unaware of how serious the threats from these other adversaries really are.
Real
adversaries.
And in fact, in a conversation I had with Mike Pompeo in our Pray Vote Stand event last night, saying that he's very concerned for our nation and the vulnerability that we have, the risk that we're at by this type of messaging from this administration, because it communicates weakness and it makes us vulnerable as a nation.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talked about the military, and listen, you and I both know, because we've both served in the military, that weapons are important, but there is nothing more important in the military than cohesion within a unit. That's what causes people to be willing to die for their teammate, their battle buddy. And when you destroy that cohesion with things like what they're doing to our military today with this critical race theory, starting out with, you're telling every white person there, you are an oppressor, and you're telling every black person you're a victim. How is that going to build cohesion within those units? And look, Tony, you know that I've seen men give their lives for their battle buddies. I've seen them. I've written them up for the medals of honor for doing just that. But you've got to have that cohesion in that unit, because that's an equalizer. That's as important as the technology and weapons that you give them.
Have you, I mean, you served 36 and a half years in our nation's military. You've seen good leadership. You've seen bad leadership. Where would you put this administration?
Yeah, it's at the bottom. It's at the bottom. Look, we're destroying the morale of our military right now. And I'm surprised that the senior leaders in our military have not at least gone in, and maybe they have, and we just don't know it, and maybe they got rejected, but going in and sat down with this president and said, look, you're the commander in chief, and we're going to do what you order us to do. However, we need to maintain the strength of our military, and we need to be focused on using the time that we have to prepare for war. And these social experiments are not conducive to us being ready to fight China or Russia or Iran. And we need to go back, take a step back, and look at how much time we're spending on things that are doing nothing but dividing us, tearing us apart, and get back to readiness. Everything is about readiness. Be ready to win the nation's wars. Douglas MacArthur told the people at West Point in 1963, when he stood in the mess hall there and he looked at him, he said, your mission remains determined, fixed, inviolable. It is to win the nation's wars. That's not changed. It's still to win the nation's wars.
That's the mission, but it's certainly not the vision under this administration.
It is not. Listen, let me just say one thing. When the president came out here a couple of weeks ago and talked about the military, what did he talk about? He talked about he had them design new flight suits for pregnant pilots to be able to fly. He has designed a new helmet for them to be able to wear the helmet and still have their hair. Tony, you don't know how scary that really is. I mean, you don't know how that hit me when the president gets up and the first real thing he said about our military is all about flight suits for pregnant women and helmets that they could wear their hair down. And that's his priorities. How about his priorities being putting the best technology in their hands, giving them the best opportunities to train and prepare for war and be ready when the next war comes?
General, we're up against the end of the program, but very quickly, one final question. How resilient is our military to face administrations like this and continue with that mission?
Yeah, our military will bounce back if we get leadership in there. But the current set of leaders have not done anything that I can see to stop this president and his social experiments. And I think that our military can come back. They did come back under Donald Trump, but we got to have some leaders.
All right. General Jerry Boykin, thanks so much for joining us in studio.
Glad to be with you.